a complete change of agency from man, God to man in the fullest sense, because uh, even at this point of our life, we know sometimes we take a decision with the God category, giving it prime importance in certain matters, whereas we use the secular category of human, secular but skewed category of human being at certain points of life. So we are actually oscillating between a God-centered universe, God as a tool for interpreting our reality, and also the human sciences as a tool, as tools for interpreting our reality, understanding our reality. So it's a kind of moving to and fro, and taking advantageous positions as and when we want to, because about things that we are not very much sure of, we use the God category, and we use the scientific terms, scientific concepts, scientific attitude when it comes to certain uh, areas in life where such decisions can be taken in a secular, in an objective scientific manner. So now let us focus on the human being. Who is this human being? It is an absolute human being, I told you. It's an absolute human being, and this human being doesn't exist. It's only an imaginary human being, and this human is very important in the sense that it is marked in English with a capital I. That is why wherever we write I in English, we write it as capital I in the sense of a subject, an agent. As a subject, when you write I, representing yourself or representing, you know, a person representing himself, we use the capital I, and that capital I is is from the Enlightenment period or Renaissance culture, where I becomes capital. I becomes primary. I become, the basic factor, basic agency of expression of oneself, the individual who has attained a prime position in the discourses, in the power system. And that is why we write I as capital. The I has gone into language, English language, with a capital form, capital shape, marking the Enlightenment or Renaissance focus on the individual, the man, as different from the hitherto used kind of entity, God. Now, who is this man? Who is this man? Who is this human being? We usually use man and human being as interchangeable words. Who is this man? Is it man alone? Is it a human being that represents everyone? That is a lesbian, a gay person, a transgender, a disabled person, a woman, an ordinary woman, an elite woman, a poor woman. Are all these different varieties of human beings standing at different stations of life, represented by the I that we write, or the human that we have conceived through the process of Renaissance? About Renaissance and Enlightenment, we have to differentiate that. I think in the years of Renaissance, Renaissance is a new birth, actually, a new birth. New birth, Renaissance is in a way related to, uh, you know, Anthropocene. Anthro is human. Scene is new. And Anthropocene also means a new man, a new being, just like Renaissance, revival of, interest, rebirth. That's the meaning. And in Malayalam, it is Navodhanam. Navothanam in the sense that standing up, becoming active. So a change, a radical change. From you move from a sitting position to a standing position, you are about to do something. You are in the sitting position because God was doing everything. God was making you do things. You are just a doll in the hands of God, just a tool in the hands of God, in the God-centered universe. It was conceived like that, because in Ramayana we find, you know, uh, beings who stand in between God and men. They are man gods, women gods. So, in between, intermediary beings, reincarnations, incarnations and avatars, and going back to the other world. And this is another aspect of God-centeredness that we see in the epics. And when we come to Shakespeare's, dramas, we can find that, Hamlet. Hamlet is responsible for what Hamlet does. Macbeth is responsible for what Macbeth does. But at the same time, half of the, you know, uh, responsibility is shared by the God category also. And that is why witches appear. Witches appear, and witches or fate, wherever they appear, is another form of God. So Shakespearean dramas or plays, in the Indian context also, in certain cases, you can consider as passing from a God-centered universe to a human-centered universe. Shagundala was, left alone, rejected because of, fate in a way. She loses the ring. The ring is actually a strategy. So, Shagundala, the story of Shagundala can be read in a different manner in the, in the present times from an environmental point of view. They are forest people. They are forest people, and they are village people. Village and forest are also again another two conflicting entities, Grama and forest. Grama was formed by civilizing the forest, and the forest has to be civilized. That is another thing. And civilizing the forest, it's an intervention. Dushyanta's coming is an invasion of the forest. So you can read it that way. Rereadings are possible. Anyway, we are not interested in that at this point. We can see, a human being was conceived in the whole process of humanism, in the whole process of development, in the whole process of, what we call the journey of modernity, the journey of modernity from Renaissance onwards. Renaissance being the new birth, the birth of a new human being, which is, in other names, in other words, Anthropocene, the new man. And who was the new man? Does this new man represent all other depressed and marginalized categories? We have to think of these things now. Actually, we can see humanism uh, had a very skewed, lopsided view of material things. Though we have been told occasionally, every now and then sometimes, for the human being, everything happens in the world. The constitution is for the human being. The national government is for the human being. The freedom movement was for the human being, every one of us. In all countries, I'm not talking about India alone. In all countries, Pakistan was also doing this. All Germany was doing this. America was doing this against their half brothers, fighting against their half brothers, swearing in the name of everyone in America. It is the freedom of America. It is the freedom of American citizens, they said, but the black were not free. The blacks were not able to go to schools. The blacks were not able to eat in the same restaurant with white people. So they had to fight for that. They have to protest against racism, apartheid. All these, tell us that the human being conceived, in the process of liberal humanism was actually not a human being representing all types of human beings, all categories of human beings of all stations, uh, in different cultures, different communities. So who was this human being represented actually? We can say for our convenience, though it is reductive, I would like to put it like this. The human being represented by Renaissance was a white Anglo-Saxon upper class heterosexual male. A white Anglo-Saxon upper class heterosexual male. So let us look at each word. White. When the white man becomes the human being, or the human concept represents only the white person, that instance itself, the dark-skinned people of the world, the brown-skinned Indians, all become lesser human beings, subordinates, subjugated human beings which are subhuman. And this is where colonialism actually gets justified. They come to India, looked at our skins. They went to Africa, looked at their skins, and found difference. And difference was constructed in the colonial discourses in a particular manner so that darkness, Africa became a dark continent, and the dark-skinned people became subhuman. And the brown-skinned people became subhuman. The African wilderness, that is important to green studies. The African wilderness had to be tamed. The Indian wilderness had to be tamed. And this is where we find environmental literature, how environmental literature, the possibilities of environmental literature, possibilities of new readings in environmental literature is possible. Because, if you read, accounts of conquest of Africa, accounts of conquest of Indian landscapes, Indian, you know, Indian land, loss of land. In colonialism, most important aspect is loss of land. And these lands are conquered, these lands are discovered. Europeans are said to discover lands. Victoria Falls was discovered, they say. People were living right about around it. But they say they discovered those places. So discovery itself is one strategy of conquest. Wonder is another strategy of conquest. You look at, differently colored Indians, differently dressed Indians, differently clad Indians, differently shaped Indians, and you feel great wonder. And using that feeling of wonder, that emotion of wonder, that attitude of wonder, you construct a human being, construct an Indian and African in a particular manner so that he becomes a stereotypical category who has to be civilized, who has to be, uh, legitimately brought under certain civilizing, you know, civilizing regulations. That is why they had separate rules for India and Africa. So the conquest of the land was actually couched in a language where you can find the land and women are connected. The Indian land or the African land or the non-European land were looked upon as spaces which had to be pacified, as spaces which are wild, which are to be conquered. And, in the description, in the words that they use in the process of description of the conquered lands or the wilderness or the wild lands they have come across, and felt bewildered or embarrassed in the language of rape, actually in the language of rape. So that is why I say white, the white was represented by the human being, and not all the white. And that is why, the Americans were not included in the process. White, Anglo-Saxon, only Anglo-Saxons were included. I'm speaking about British colonialism only in the context of, green readings, because about 80% of the world was, uh, colonized by Britain, and rest of the non-European world was actually shared by other European countries. So white, we have a counterpart, black. We have a devilish culture, in their words, the Negro culture. The word Negro itself is an interesting word, in the sense that this word has given rise to many other words which carry the ideological contempt of the word Negro. Denigrate, another one, a very good example. We usually use the word denigrate. Denigrate is to make a Negro, to reduce to the position of a Negro. There, only if you accept a Negro as a subhuman being, denigrate is an acceptable word. Otherwise, it is a highly, pejorative word, highly abusive word. So the white was represented by the human being or the human being that was conceived in the process of humanism, in the process of liberal humanism. Anglo-Saxons only were considered human beings. Rest of the communities, the rest of the human communities were considered to be subhuman beings, and they needed to be civilized according to, the European communities. The white, Anglo-Saxon, upper class, a middle class emerged. And we know we have to put all these things in the context of capitalism. Capitalism, where profit is important, for investment is important, for regulations are important. Rivers are brought under regulations. Roads are brought under regulations. Regulations are everywhere, and regulations are important for, this kind of exploitation also. So what we find is upper class, money becomes important. Moneyed people become important. So the rich, wealthy, white Anglo-Saxon is represented by the concept of the human being. White, Anglo-Saxon, upper caste, heterosexual. Heterosexual in the sense that people, male and female, getting married and running a family. That is a heterosexual family. Then when only heterosexual aspects are, represented by the liberal humanist being, conceived liberal humanist being, what happens is all other sexualities, transgenders, gay people, lesbians, all of them become, subhuman, uncivilized, and absurd people, abnormal people. And that is why we have been keeping transsexuals away, we have been keeping transgender people away, we have been keeping gay people and lesbians away from our universities, colleges, schools, all public platforms, even jobs. And in most of the places they were either killed or thrown away, just like twins were in Africa, in the earlier centuries before European intervention, because twins were actually a rare kind of birth, an unusual kind of birth, in the sense that most common were single births. So they threw away, in some parts of Nigeria, they threw away both the twins into bush, and naturally were eaten by animals. That was something wrong on the part of, something unethical on the part of, according to our standards, unethical on the part of, the Nigerians at that time. And the Europeans had to bring about laws to change that. So there are good aspects in the Western civilization, but largely because it is a geographical movement of one nation to the other, it was also a process of conquest. The conquest was described as if, looking at the land that was conquered as a woman, feminizing the land first, feminizing the land through, through narration, and then going forward for the conquest, the process of conquest. At first the material conquest, actually the geographical conquest, and then the cultural conquest. It's actually a kind of conflicting kind of encounter between the Western values and other regional values. So the term heterosexual immediately keeps out other sexualities and makes them illegitimate. And the last is heterosexual male. A male the male is represented by the conceived human of the liberal humanist project. Naturally, female women become unrepresented. Women become unrepresented. Dark-skinned people become unrepresented. Disabled people become unrepresented. Then different castes are unrepresented, and naturally, the the central concept of human being in the process of liberal humanism represents only a particular kind of people. And this is where all the movements that we now hear about comes into being. The anti-colonial movement. The anti-colonial movement, was initiated. There were bloody wars. There were, peaceful struggles, as in India, sometimes going violent. And it was an attempt on the part of Indians at large coming together of different subcultures to redefine the concept of the human being. The concept of the human being was redefined to a certain extent to include the Indian, the imaginary Indian, again, an absolute construction as a human being. And the dark person was also included to a certain extent by bringing about constitutional changes, regulations, new regulations, admission to schools and colleges, equality of a certain extent provided to all these communities. So the black people, the brown people get access into the concept of the human. They become part of, it is made, the concept, human concept was made inclusive in the case of the black people, the brown people, and then, the poor people in the sense that widespread regulation changes reforms were introduced in England, in all over the world, during these centuries, which we call the the Enlightenment period. So up to 1960s, we find, and feminist movement again. Feminist movement is, the feminist movement is making only one important, demand. We have to be considered as human beings. The human status has to be given to women, and to a certain extent that is also uh, made inclusive, but still a lot of things are to be done. So it was at this point, at the cultural turn, other categories, unrepresented categories, again, all these categories that I spoke about: women, children, disabled people, black people, poor people, sexual minorities, all these are marginalized people, all these are peripheral people, even now peripheral. And whenever something drastic happens, some disaster happens, a war happens, if there's a battle, for instance, demonetization, anything happens, it is the peripheral people who suffer most. And along with them, there is one category until now even not getting access, or only uh, in a small manner, in a slender manner getting access, was nature as such. And this is where the green studies, green literature become very important. That is, the concept of the human being has to be more inclusive by adding the concept of the element of nature also. That is, nature is not a landscape, nature is not a framework, nature is not a setting for human action. The non human, which is part of nature, as well as human, is also a part as well. So, the concept of the human has to be redefined by including the concept of nature also, or the element of nature also. Nature cannot be seen as a background, as a setting. Nature is part of, nature is connected to human beings. Nature is, human nature also in that sense. And the nature culture divide that was, the basis of Western, Enlightenment thinking, was actually challenged by expanding the green movement and freeing the movement from, Emerson, Thoreau, and such Western American, exponents of green movement. We have Sundarlal Bahuna, we have Gandhian values, we have Gandhism, and we have hundreds and thousands of subcultural movements like the Bishnois sacrificing themselves, Bishnoi women sacrificing themselves. We have Sundarlal Bahuna inspired by his own wife. Such subcultures and micro subcultures, microcultures coming up. We have resistant traditions. We have Plachimada struggle like that. We have struggles going on, anti-nuclear struggles, all over India and all over the world. Uh, all these coming up and putting nature also within the human context, nature also as part of the human concept, uh, the concept of human being has to be redefined by merging it with nature, not seeing nature and human being as as conflicting categories, nature as something to be conquered. Especially when we look at scientific discourses in the Renaissance times, we find nature as an alien, nature as forest as an alien. Even now, forests are considered like that. Forest and city and country, city and country. We always, idealize countryside and say countryside is beautiful, countryside is, a paradise. Actually, it is not so. We always have certain very wrong notions about cities also. Instead of looking at them as binaries, you have to see them as integrated, categories, integrated existence. And this pattern of connection of human beings with the rest of the things in the world, whether they are inanimate, animate, or differently, distributed all over the world. And this pattern is important, and this connection is important. And we are facing the sixth, massive extinction in the world, and maybe at the end of which, whenever a species is lost, we have to warn ourselves that the next species to go will be ours. And the climate changes that is going on now, with flash floods and our November months becoming days like June, and ice, melting, you know, melting in in places where in Antarctic and Arctic where ice melting, as it had happened uh, at no time earlier. So all these are happening in our world, and it is in this context that green literature becomes important, green readings becomes important, green rereadings become important. We have to even look at development event. Look at development event, the kind of development event, the kind of capitalist development event, with a suspicious eye, in the sense that every development increases, the tension in the world, the it brings issues to people. It causes migration to a larger extent. It leads to loss of livelihood, loss of dignity of human beings. The fight against the Narmada Dam, we have seen a long-standing fight about Narmada Dam, anti-nuclear struggles, where we find the state is on one side and the people are on the other side, and the Anthropocene, the intervention of this kind of a human being who considers himself as the ruler of the world or the best creation of the world, uh, who have who think who have the right to dominate over other forms of life, inanimate and animate forms of life, has gone a wrong way. And it is to tell the new generation, it is to interpret the reality in a different way, uh, in the sense that it would be useful for the community to take up a sustainable path of development, where the life of Earth can be extended, the life of the planet can be extended, and that is the major concern of all the countries now. Whether something happens in America, something happens in Europe, or something happens in Asia, or Africa, it doesn't matter. It affects the planet wherever such things happen. Degradation is not not a localized phenomenon. It may look like a localized phenomenon, but it affects the whole world. Just like the story of the crow who put stones into the pot to drink water. And whenever something is put into the sea, it doesn't affect the country that is adjacent to the sea. It affects the whole world. When air is polluted, it will affect the whole world, not that country alone or that region alone. So we find nationalist narratives are questioned, because nationalist narratives in some way, justified and legitimized the destruction of nature, pollution, things like that. This category, green writing, green reading, and green rereading strategies, actually provide a new, spirit to the redefinition of the human being. And with the redefinition of the human being, a new consciousness, attaining a new consciousness, we will be able to look at the world in a different way, look at the world, look at the earth in a friendly way, and ensure our existence along with the existence of other forms of life. Thank you.